Progressive World podcast with your hosts, Drea Klein-Bergman and John Daniele, brought to you by the Progressive World Federalists, a civil society organization that examines global policy through a progressive, anti-oppression lens.
Welcome back to Progressive World Podcast, part 2 of our Belgium EU episode. In today's podcast, we are in conversation with Dr. Tom Bruyer, and we'll be taking a closer look at what has been going on in Europe since May, especially with the Black Lives Matter protests in Europe, and speaking further on EU threats to security and how the EU will be moving forward without its once trusted ally of the United States. Tom? Let's just jump right into the protests. You know, Tom, what was absolutely astonishing to me being here in North America and especially after George Floyd was murdered by the police and the movements of Black Lives Matter, I was really surprised to see this go on in Europe. And I saw especially what happened in throughout Belgium. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that. From having lived through that.
Yeah. So first of all, I think everybody, of course, was following what was happening in the U.S., in North America, and we saw these, horrible images, the protests going on, and so on. And it's just amazing how everything spread that quickly, and we even had protests here. But the interesting bit is, I think, even if you had, of course, protesters talking about George Floyd and having these banners with Black Lives Matter and so on, they were also quickly focusing on, I think, our specific national context. And the same happened in France, in Germany, in Spain, and so on. And here it took on the dimension of, or they started to focus not just on issues of discrimination, xenophobia in Belgian society, but they also linked it up with our colonial past. Because as everybody knows, the Belgian Congo was an official colony of Belgium until 1960. Um, Lots of atrocities being committed in the name of King Leopold II and later on the Belgian state. But oddly enough, and for decades, Belgians were silent about that colonial history or just knew the cliches or not so many elements. I myself never had lots of history classes focusing on the colonial history. I don't know why, but that was the case. And now all of a sudden you have this new generation, these especially young protesters, asking questions and wanting to know more. And we even had an official apology by our current king, King Philippe, apologizing for the atrocities committed during the colonial era. But I think it's just interesting to see how this global, or at first American, phenomenon of Black Lives Matter turned into a global phenomenon, but then at each time focusing on specific elements of a national culture. For example, here, focusing on our horrible colonial legacy in Belgium. And this is still going on, the whole discussion about what happened in the Congo, in what way we are responsible, and how this is still fueling certain stereotypes or issues of discriminations against Black people or people of other cultures, immigrants inside Belgian society.
I mean, do you see, because of this, I'm going to call it direct democracy, right? Taking it to the streets. Do you see it actually changing in how they teach curriculum in Belgium?
Well, I think it will, because you have that very open culture of discussion now, of lots of books being published or republished, uh, giving different narratives. And I think people want that, because for a long time, you just had uh, a very official narrative or not really lots of discussion or books being published. And now, for example, here in my local bookshop, I can show you 8 or 10 new titles about, for example, issues of identity, racism, but especially focusing on the Belgian Congo or Belgium's colonial legacy. So yeah, I think these Black Lives Matter protests here are also revealing issues within our own society that were silenced for a long time or maybe not out in the open. And I think the same is happening in other countries. And you also have people linking this issue with the whole question of migration inside of Europe since 2015. Of course, we had lots of Syrian refugees from the Middle East, from Asia coming to Europe. And of course, Europe is still grappling with that. Every country is. So, also there, you can see in Germany and France these Black Lives Matter protests, not necessarily focusing on just the American context anymore, but linking it up with European discussions, ongoing discussions about identity and migration.
Yeah, I love this. This actually gives me, watching this from afar of what's going on in Europe, it gives me a lot of hope as I see more young people, massive amounts of young people getting involved and actually wanting to be part of politics and policy and change the status quo. So when I now think about the EU, I have a lot more hope and that it can actually pull together and do these reforms and stay intact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two very important aspects there because you said reforms, because that's something I think the EU has to do from within, reforming the institutions, showing that there actually is that this is a democratic institution or union, because lots of people are saying, well, why would we believe these unelected, bureaucrats and so on? So I think Europe needs to reform its institutions and at the same time listen to these protests and young protesters, because this is, as you said, a new generation wanting to have um, a different kind of democracy, direct participation. And I'm also thinking about the climate discussion. This is also, I think, a big issue, besides the one about Black Lives Matter, where you
Yeah.
had young people all over Europe taken to the streets, expressing their opinion, wanting to change the status quo. And even that was a surprise for many people. And of course, that hasn't been going on now because of COVID. But I'm sure if, let's hope, the world returns to normal next year, you will see these protests being picked up too. I think this will not stop.
Yeah, let's hope not. Let's hope not. I feel like direct democracy happens through mass participation and peaceful protests and demanding change from politicians. And I hope that this really propels us forward. And I hope that, especially in Belgium, I mean, this is the heart of the EU, and if Belgium fails, I think we all fail as a Western democracy. And these ideals of the EU are just so central to uh, world federalists. And it's just a personal connection to me as well, having lived in Europe, prior to the EU forming and after. And I don't want to go back to that. I want the EU to remain strong um, and have this, more direct democracy involved.
So it sounds like a structure that's fairly representative of the peoples of Europe. I mean, you have representation at a local level, you have representation at higher, more federal levels. How representative is it, would you say, of the European people, and how does somebody who is pro-European combat that narrative that there are unelected bureaucrats in the system that hold a lot of influence and sway on policy matters?
Yeah. Well, I think in every country, and I speak for Belgium, of course, when there's an election, and this could be a regional election or a federal election, for example, here, you can also vote for European representatives. So since a couple of years here, we have all these elections in Belgium coinciding at the same time. So in 2018, 19, excuse me, when we had our elections here, I had to vote for a regional representative, a federal one, and then there was also a European list. And the same parties, let's say the Christian Democrats, the Socialists, the Liberals, they all appoint a representative for the European list. But for lots of people, that level, that European level, is very abstract. Because, of course, these are not the politicians you will meet in the streets that will represent you in your own country. And sometimes you have names on these lists that people don't know so well. And that's where you have that whole myth of who are these bureaucrats? Who did I vote for? Did we actually vote for them or not? But still, in each country you have, of course, fair elections, and you actually vote for the European representatives that go on to become members of parliament, of the European Parliament in Brussels. So it's hard to say that these are unelected bureaucrats, but I think it's just that whole fascination. Maybe it's pretty similar to the perception of Washington, D.C., because Brussels is such an important political city, the capital of the European Union, where you have all these meetings between 27 member states. You have that huge European Parliament. Um, so I think it's a fascination for lots of people. And at the same time, I think because of the importance and all the lobbying going on, you have these myths that are being spread. And especially in times of crisis, or in certain countries a bit more than other countries, you have this distrust and people thinking that everything is being decided in Brussels and they don't have a stake, they don't have a say. So they're scared of the power that's um, focused, that's based in Brussels. Maybe a bit like Washington, D.C. in the US, I guess.
The other aspect of the EU that has always struck me as interesting is the plurality of political expression that you have across the board. Here in North America, we have a tendency to have a conservative party or a liberal party, but there's not enough sort of nuance to those expressions of political values. But in Europe, you have a number of liberal parties and a number of conservative parties that are from center right to center left and leftist point of view. Can you speak a little bit about how this sort of plurality has helped or hindered the opposition to authoritarian populism? Is this something that is making authoritarian populism easier to be instituted into government, or do you think it's something that can help detract from those authoritarian populist views and perspectives? Does this plurality temper political expression across the board?
I think it can be both, because when I look at the Belgian context, for example, in our new government now since a couple of months, we have 7 political parties, ranging from the Greens to the Socialists to the Liberals, Christian Democrats, and so on. And on the one hand, you could say, look, this is a proof that plurality works. There's lots of different political factions having to work together to form a government. It's not just left, right, conservatives versus liberals. But at the same time, the political landscape gets fractured, fragmented. And I think, again, in times of crisis, for example, and we've seen it with the financial crisis and now, you still have populist parties gaining ground. And people are being fed up with all these smaller political parties that have always been in government. Because, for example, now here we have lots of parties that are around 10%. And often people are saying, we had enough of these 10% political parties. We will vote for something else now. And that's where you usually have uh, populist parties on the extreme left and the extreme right. And we have both of these gaining in popularity. And we've seen it here since a couple of years. And of course, it's a European phenomenon. Think of Germany, think of France, think of Eastern European member states. Where you have that plurality, of course, and people can vote for, let's say, 5, 6, 7 or more political parties. And you used to have, in certain countries, the tradition of having the main parties, let's say socialist, Christian Democrats, like in Germany, forming a government. But of course, when they are falling in the polls and they can no longer form a government with just 2 or 3 parties, you have these more unstable governments, like here, with 5, 6, or 7 political parties. And that's where I think, especially now in difficult times, populist parties come across as being strong, as being challengers to the establishment, to all of these, smaller political parties that have become almost the same old for some voters. And that's also the like you said, the obstacle, because of course, because the landscape gets so fragmented and people have had enough of all these parties and they just consider them as the same old policies as before, they will try to vote for something else. And it could be the extreme left, pseudo communist parties, could be the extreme right, populists, almost neo-Nazi parties. And I think it's a threat for Europe because it's been spreading across the continent. Think of Germany, where I think a decade ago nobody would have expected an extreme right party to do so well. And all of a sudden they're winning elections on the local level, on the federal level. And the same here. I think it's the whole issue of, it's linked to several topics. It's linked to identity, to migration, to people being fed up with older, the usual form of politics. And maybe there's also, of course, an impact coming from, the Brexit vote in Britain, Donald Trump winning the election in the US in 2016. So we'll have to see where this goes inside of Europe. But yeah, I think we have multiple voices, multiple political factions, but it could be to our advantage or it could become a huge obstacle and give way to bigger populist movements also in Europe.
That's frightening.
Absolutely. You'd mentioned a couple of those issues, but is there one issue that is more prevalent than other issues that is driving this reactionary trend?
Well, I would say on a European level, it's that constant opposition, as we discussed, to the European Union. What's its use? What's the future of Europe? Will Brussels decide? Will everything be decided in Brussels or not? So inside of the European Union, it's that whole discussion since Brexit of, will there be another country exiting, leaving the European Union or not? Can we stick together or not? And is there a future for the EU? And then I think on a global level, I guess in a way similar to what's happening in North America, identity politics, reaction to migration. Of course, the European context being different to the North American one. But since 2015, with the migration crisis, every country is reacting in a different way. And I think we are still in that phase of dealing with what happened back then and how Europe will deal with migration in the future. Because we are so close to the Middle East, to Africa, this is not all of a sudden going to stop, of course.
These certainly sound like issues and challenges that are related to a structure that had been pulled together through economic integration before political integration or political alignment. How likely do you think moving into 2021, will there be some coalescing around a set of political values or shared political values in Europe that could strengthen the EU as opposed to hinder its progress towards statehood?
I think there's a real opportunity for the EU in 2021 after COVID, because of course this was a giant wake-up call, just as much in a different way, of course, as the economic crisis was 10 years ago. But now I think citizens and leaders, politicians, realize that we have to stick together because the global context is changing too, and Europe will still face the same threats in the field of international relations. Because once, hopefully, we put the COVID crisis behind us, Europe will still have to deal with Russia, with China. And people are now realizing in this health context, but the same goes for economics and politics, that it's better to be unified as a bloc. And of course, we will have our differences and discussions, which is normal. but that it's much better to stay united than to go back to some kind of 19th century politics with individual nation states taking on Russia or China, which is not really that realistic, I think.
You bring up a huge topic, the rise of illiberalism in the form of Russian oligarchy and Chinese state capitalism. With respect to these issues, what do Europeans think about China and their system? Similarly, what do Europeans think about Russia and the aggressive attitudes that it's having to its neighbors, the occupation of Crimea in Ukraine. Similarly, with China, they have 1 million Uyghurs in detention currently in China. What do Europeans think about these issues, and why is there not a more vocal opposition to these illiberal trends?
Well, I think it's you would only find sympathetic voices to China or Putin's Russia inside of some of these populist parties, because they would say, "Look, this system works much better than this old liberal order of the EU and NATO and so on." But I think that's really a minority. Let's hope so, and I'm still convinced because lots of people have seen inside of Europe what happened when Russia annexed Crimea, invaded Ukraine, the war that's still going on there, more of these frozen conflicts since the post Soviet era still taking place on the fringes of Europe. And of course, the whole European project is built on taking in more countries that share the same values, political values, ethical values, and of course also economic ones when it comes to the Eurozone. So I think people are still in that field convinced that it's far better to be part of something like the European Union or NATO to take on these challenges like Russia or China than not to have that kind of unity and protection. And I think there's also a big divide between Western and Eastern European states, because I can still remember speaking with friends from, for example, Poland, Czech Republic. For them, 1989, for example, is just a couple of decades ago. They still have stories in their family about what it was like to live under communist rule. And they are really afraid of what Russia could do the coming decades to Europe. And if Europe is not better prepared, it will have to deal with the consequences. And this is maybe something where some Europeans said, okay, you can say whatever you want about Donald Trump and how he also left us in the cold and decided to abandon the American European form of partnership. But he was right in telling Europeans, look, you have to spend maybe more money on defense and make sure that within NATO you can face up to a challenge like Russian invasion or Russian threat. So I think also that the presidency of Trump, which was frightening for lots of European countries, was also a wake up call because they realized that they couldn't just depend on the US forever when it comes to international relations or military conflicts. And they had to find more unity and be able to face these challenges themselves. So I think all of these issues have been a wake up call, but in a good way, I think, to strengthen Europe, to reform Europe, and to make sure that Europe, as such, without the dependency on the US, for example, but with a healthy partnership, can face challenges like Russia and China. So I think in that field, Europeans would be more united and hopefully not tempted to favor illiberalism, as you mentioned.
And you mentioned the United States. For decades now, the US has abdicated its role as democratic global leader. How are European states rising to that challenge? Is Europe filling in the gap to serve as a global leader in democratic thinking? Where do we stand on that issue? How well is Europe filling in that gap with the absence of the United States in global democratic leadership?
Well, I think it's not happening yet. It should be an ambition of the European Union, but I think for the moment this is not the case because Europe still has to find a stronger voice when it comes to its position globally, when it comes to taking the forefront on different issues, topics. Um, for example, even climate could be one of them. But I think Europe is still, especially these last years, trying to see how the vacuum that has been left by the US retreating from Europe, how that can be filled, and how the European Union, which has always been a powerful economic bloc, can also become a powerful political bloc and have a global voice when it comes to democracy, human rights, climate, and so on. But for the moment, this is not happening because people are afraid if Europe doesn't act soon and strengthens its union and plays a more assertive global role, China will fill the gap, Russia will fill the gap. And we've seen this, for example, in the Middle East, where you had the US retreating from some of these conflicts and so on. And then you see Russia or China stepping in aggressively, and Europe is sometimes nowhere to be seen, right? On the sidelines. And I think this really has to change. And there's lots of potential. And again, the coming years, it's a big opportunity for Europe because the US, even with the new presidency of Joe Biden, will not necessarily return to always, be there for Europe and offer that safety net, even if it is an important partnership. But even under Obama, you had the pivot to Asia and so on. The world is changing. So I think there's a real opportunity for Europe to step in and be more assertive um, on the global front, and they have to, I think.
Yeah, I even what's frightening about what you're saying, Tom, is we've had 4 years of Trump and they still haven't filled that gap. And that's a little bit scary to me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And of course, COVID intervened last year, and it was also an important election year in the US. So all of this came together. But I really think if Europe can push through some internal reforms, they can also reposition themselves on a global level, and I think they have to, even for survival, for the strength of the European Union, for the credibility of it on a global level, because it still is a very powerful economic bloc that I think lots of powerful nations in the world respect economically. Think of the G7, the G20, and so on, the Eurozone. Of course, trade is very important, economics with the EU. But when it comes to the political voice of the EU, people often still make these jokes like we're still um, years behind of what we could have done and what voice Europe should have next to the US, next to bigger nations, and especially to counter that illiberalism coming from China, from Russia.
So, we were talking about the threat from Russia and the threat from China, and certainly, if you take a look at the U.S. experience, Russia engaged in narrative warfare in order to sway hearts and minds in the 2016 election, which led ostensibly to a strengthened Trump campaign in the United States. To what extent is Europe also experiencing narrative warfare from either Russia or China on domestic EU related issues?
Well, I think there's a growing fear inside of several European countries that Russia, just as it did with the US, has already meddled in some big elections. Think of the presidential election in France, elections in Germany, and so on. And of course, since 2016 and the coverage that of the Russian meddling in the US election, Europeans are really also stepping up their game to prevent all of that fake news and all of these interventions by hackers or lobby groups to take hold in Europe, because it's a real fear. And of course, we are much closer to Russia here, and especially in Eastern Europe, it's a real fear that this will continue. And they will try to fuel that mistrust of the European Union. They will try to intervene in some elections because some of these populist parties are backed by the Kremlin, get money, get funds. So it's a really important issue, and I think far more maybe than the Chinese threat, because of course that's a threat for Europe, for the world in certain areas. But I think for us, when you talk about geopolitics, well, the Russian one is very real and present. So yeah.
And the EU's reliance on energy imports, how does that factor in? Is that caused some politicians to avoid criticism of Russia because there is so much of a market for Russia imports of crude oil, natural gas, solid fuels? How is that factoring into the equation? Is that also weakening EU's resolve in tackling these issues with Russia?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's also a topic, a discussion that's still going on, because you might remember a couple of years ago, Russia closed the tap and put some pressure on neighboring countries like Ukraine to so that they will stay dependent on Russian gas and oil in the future. So everybody knows that also in that area, Europe has to um, show a unified voice, has to react in a more assertive way, because different countries have different stakes. But even a country like Germany is still very much dependent on Russian oil and gas. And you have these discussions about new pipelines or new forms of distribution. But it's also still a weak point, I think, in European foreign policy, how to deal with Russia when it comes to international politics, when it comes to meddling in the election, but also from a geopolitical point of view, yeah, how to face that pressure that is being put on neighboring states by Russia to keep the status quo of dependency. Yeah, even in that area, the European Union can certainly play a more assertive role than it has in the past.
Tom, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. I hope that we can invite you again to speak on some of the other areas of expertise that you have, particularly on Middle East and North African issues in the world. So hope you'll come and join us again, and we can dive into related issues.
My pleasure. And of course, I'd love to join you again in the future.
Thank you, Tom.
Excellent. Take care.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Progressive World podcast, brought to you by the Progressive World Federalists. You can reach us through our website at www.progressiveworldfederalists.com. Join us in advocating for stronger global democratic institutions, the decolonization of the international system, and global justice reform.